If you'd like to turn to the person next to you and say to them, because I know you love doing this, despite the moans that I hear every time I say, please turn the person next to you. I know really you like to do it. So this is what I'd like you to say. You don't know what you don't know. Okay, if you do have your Bibles, once again, I'd like you to pick them up. This time we're going all the way back to Genesis. So the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37, and commencing at verse 1. This morning we're going to look at the story of Joseph, the second youngest son of Jacob. And this is how his story begins. Nope. That's what you should have had up last time. So let's move to the next one. Thanks, Ken. Genesis chapter 37. Hey, that's it. Thank you. And so you can follow on the screen with me as I read. So Jacob, that is Joseph's father, settled again in the land of Canaan where his father had lived as a foreigner. And so this is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, so 17, a teenager, just keep that tucked away, 17. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. So in other words, Joseph was a bit of a tattletale. He had 10 brothers and saw it upon himself to let his father know what any of them were doing when they stepped out of line. And this was probably why he was a bit of a tattletale. Verse 3. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children, because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. So from the outset, we learn that Joseph had a couple of things going against him. Then one night, verse 5, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. I'm guessing that even if you've never heard this story before, you know what his brothers are going to think about this dream. His brothers responded, "So you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. So no surprises there. Verse 9. So Joseph had another dream. And again, he told his brothers about it. Listen, I have had another dream, he said. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed low before me. Down to verse 12. Soon after this, Joseph's brothers went to pasture their father's flocks at She. That's the place? Nice. When they had been gone for some time, Jacob said to Joseph, "Your brothers are pasturing the sheep at..." Thank you. "Get ready and I will send them to you." "I'll send you to them." "I'm ready to go," Joseph replied. And of course he is. So Joseph heads off, and as he's walking towards his brothers, they see him in the distance, and before he reaches them, they hatch a plot to kill him. Verse 19. "Here comes the dreamer," they said. "Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns." Oh man, I'm having a tough morning, aren't I? Oh, okay. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. But when Reuben heard of their scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue. "Let's not kill him," he said. "Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into the empty cistern here in the wilderness. Then he'll die without our laying a hand on him." Isn't it nice to have big brothers? Reuben was secretly planning to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing. Then they grabbed him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty, there was no water in it. Then just as they were sitting down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. That would have been weird, wouldn't it? Let's just stick to what the Bible says, I think. A caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, come by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. Now, I'm going to pause at this point. I don't know how well you get along with your siblings, for those of you that have siblings. And there are many times, maybe, when you think about killing them or selling them into slavery. But I'm guessing that you never went down that track. Yeah, who knows? But can you imagine what Joseph would have been feeling at this time? He's 17 years of age. 17, and he's just been sold into slavery. Now, I wonder what internal struggles he was facing at this time. I wonder if he was thinking, I wonder if it caused him to have one of those heart-to-hearts with God. Hey God, you give me this dream, and in my dream I'm at the top of the heap, but my reality is that I'm now at the bottom of the heap. What's with that, God? Where are you, God? Why, God? And I say this because at this point of the story, there is nothing redeeming about his situation. Nothing, not one thing. And you and I, who know this story well, who knows where Joseph ends up, it's easy for us to reason, well, it's okay. He gets there in the end. Yeah, he's facing a little bit of trial at the moment, but, hope is on the horizon. But what do we say to people who find themselves where Joseph finds himself? What do you say to someone who has lost family or freedom or any of the basic liberties that you and I take for granted? Then what? Maybe life for you is a mess. Maybe your marriage is in a bit of a mess at the moment, or your kids are causing you much grief, or maybe you're in a job that you really hate, but you have family to support and a mortgage to pay, and maybe the bills just keep piling up, or maybe for you, some people just keep dragging you down, and you're feeling stuck. Then what? What then? Let's pick up the story at chapter 39, verse 1. When Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. Potiphar was captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. It's an interesting turn of phrase. Joseph, who was in Egypt. Joseph, who was a long way from his family. Joseph, who was a long way from home. Joseph, who was now a slave and who had just been sold to another party. To this Joseph belongs this reality. The Lord was with him. But I thought that all had to be well. I thought that all had to be resolved. I thought that an answer to prayer was proof that God was with you, or wealth or health or whatever was proof that God was with you. But obviously not. The Lord was with Joseph. So he succeeded. He succeeded, or as the NIV puts it, he prospered. But before we get carried away with what prosper meant for Joseph, let's read the remainder of the story, and let's remember that he's still a slave. So Joseph succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this. So there was something to Joseph, something about Joseph that stood out. And Potiphar realized that the Lord was with him, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. So, amen, we shout. You know, what a great end to a riveting story. See, Darren, you were wrong. You have little faith. Everything turned out well. Or does it? Let's read on. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and sleep with me," she demanded. So Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." Well, what an incredible line from a guy who could quite easily reason that God has done nothing for him. Now, how tempting. You know, this God thing, where has it got me? I keep playing by the rules, but it doesn't seem to help me get where I want to get. I'm playing by the rules, but it leads to more ruin, more despair, more heartbreak. So why bother? Joseph is a long way from home. And here he is in the heat of temptation with little evidence that God was actually with him. Yeah, he had a dream once and he keeps bumping into this line, God is with me, God is with me. But beyond that, what really did Joseph have? And yet, how does he respond? Despite whatever I am going through, despite my current circumstances, despite things not panning out the way that I had dreamed, why would I want to take this risk? Why would I want to hinder? Why would I want to jeopardize my relationship with God? A few weeks ago, Kathy and I attended Delve. Now, Delve is a conference for anyone in the Salvation Army who's exploring officership or ministry within the Salvation Army. And the reason why Kathy and I went was because we were asked to come and share a little bit of our testimony, our story with the delegates. And after we did so, Cheryl, who was interviewing us, sort of snuck in a question at the end, one that we really weren't that prepared for. And she asked us, what is the one thing you want these people to know? What is the one thing you want these people to know? And my response, which surprised me, was fairly quick. As soon as she asked the question, one thing popped in my mind and it came out straight away. And I simply said, my answer to the question was, you can trust God. You can trust God, which means you can trust God with your life. And you can trust God with the decisions that you have to make. And why was I able to so easily share such a thought? Because I've proven it. I've had to, and I've proven it time and time again. You see, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what you don't know. Let's read on. She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day. But he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. One day, however, no one else was around when he went in to do his work. She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, "Come on, sleep with me." Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream, he ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind with me." She kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. Then she told him her story. "That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me," she said. "But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me." Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into prison. So Joseph's where he would be if he did do what she wanted him to do, even though he did not go ahead and do it. Nice one, God. So he took Joseph and threw him into prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. And there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph. So let's recap. Joseph, who has done everything right, is where? While those around him who seem to do everything wrong are where? And why? Because the Lord was with who? Joseph. You know, I wonder if Joseph was thinking, "Hey, Lord, I think it's time you were with someone else. Since you have been with me, I've been thrown into a cistern, sold into slavery, accused of a crime I did not commit. Now here am I. I'm in prison. Now please be with someone else, Lord. Please be with my brothers." You know, if God was with Joseph, why didn't God act on Joseph's behalf? Now, why didn't God intervene before Joseph was thrown into prison? Now, why didn't God act sooner rather than later? And if that's not puzzling enough, here's what comes next. And the Lord showed Joseph his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favourite with the prison warden. Does that make any sense to you? And the Lord made Joseph a favourite with the prison warden. Now, I always thought, maybe this is just me, but if God is blessing you, you don't know the prison warden. And the Lord made Joseph a favourite with the prison warden. And before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The warden had no more worries, thanks again, God, because the Lord was with Joseph and caused everything he did to succeed. And I just want to pause once again. And I'm pausing at this point of the story because I want to ask this question. Have you ever faced something that was traumatic? And you thank God because you got through it. But it's also left you wondering why you had to face it at all. You know, I'm quite surprised that this line does not appear in the story of Joseph. "Thanks, Lord, for helping me while I'm in prison." But quite frankly, I don't want to be in prison. Now, have you ever said to God something like this? "Thanks, Lord, that I feel your presence during this time of illness, but I don't want to be ill." Thanks, Lord, for carrying me through the funeral of my partner. But seriously, Lord, I miss them. Thanks, Lord, for helping us through this time of uncertainty. But seriously, Lord? Seriously? The story of Joseph finishes with what I think is one of the most remarkable statements about faith. It's a remarkable statement, and I think it's one of the most remarkable found anywhere in the Bible. Many years later, Joseph is once again reunited with his brothers. But this time the tables are turned. It's Joseph that holds all the power. And so his brothers are worried that he will take revenge on them for what he did to them. And so they go to him and they throw themselves before him and they place themselves at his mercy. And this is how he responds to their pleas. Verse 19 of chapter 50. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done." And there's a lot of great stuff happening in Joseph's life at this time. But God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And what's so remarkable about this line is that this approach very much shaped Israel's idea about God for many generations. To this day, at the core of Jewish belief lies this unrelenting confidence in God to somehow, strangely, produce good out of the bad. And so that's why when we skip forward, 1,000 or so years, we find Paul, who was still in a prison cell. And in prison, he was able to write. And I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me here has helped to spread the good news. And because this is so Paul goes on to say, because this is the case, because I know that God somehow strangely can produce good from bad, this is how I will respond. I fully expect and hope that I will never be ashamed, but that I will continue to be bold for Christ as I've been in the past. And I trust that my life will bring honour to Christ whether I live or die. And then, just in case the people of Philippi are not all that convinced by Paul's argument, he then throws in this little gem. And this is what I want you to know. We are in this struggle together. In other words, your struggle is not your own, nor is it unique. We're in this struggle together. You have seen my struggle in the past, Paul goes on to write, and you know that I am still in the midst of it. Now, Joseph said his comment with hindsight, but Paul does not. Paul is saying this while his story is going on. You have seen my struggle in the past, and you know that I am still in the midst of it. But I want you to know, what I want you to know is I have complete faith that God will somehow, strangely, produce good from bad. You intended to harm me, Joseph said to his brothers. But God who somehow strangely can produce good from bad, had other plans for me and my life and my experiences. And because I did not surrender to whatever the circumstances were throwing at me, what is now being done is the saving of many lives. There's only one way to test this. There's only one way to test this. And that's to keep walking and to keep trusting and to keep struggling with God. Because if you give up, then what? You'll never know. Because you don't know what you don't know. You'll get to hear all these great stories about God without ever experiencing the greatness yourself. And so I want to finish this morning a little differently than normal. What I'd like to do, and I'm also conscious of the fact that there are many away today. Many have taken the most of the long weekend, and that's okay. Those of us that are in the room, those of us that are here this morning, if you have a parent or a grandparent who were part of this church or part of the Salvation Army, if you're here this morning because you're what we would call a second generation or third generation Salvationist, you're here because you've had mother or father or whatever, somebody of the family were part of the Salvation Army of the church. If that's you, can you just stand for a moment, please? Somewhere in your family line was a man or woman who stuck with God. And because of their faithfulness, you now find yourself in this place of faith. So my question to you, will you too remain faithful so that many more lives can be saved? Please be seated. Now what I'd like to happen is for all those people who have no history of past members being part of this congregation. And so if you're the first of your family members to attend this church, again, I'd like you to stand. Wow, incredible. I want to applaud you guys, I really do. So for those that are seated, let's just applaud them. When Joseph was with his brothers, he asked them, "Am I in the place of God?" And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. He then went on to remind his brothers that they had intended to harm him, and no doubt there would be people or circumstances that will try to harm you or hurt you or put you down or whatever. But in those times, remember this, God can somehow strangely produce good from bad. So please be seated. And so I conclude by repeating what I said earlier. There's only one way to test this, and that's to keep walking and to keep trusting and to keep struggling with God. Because if you give up, then what? You'll never know. And maybe a next generation will never know. Because you don't know what you don't know.